Jack Gordon Institute, the Women, Peace and Security Forum. I'm Dewey Turner, and it's a true pleasure to be with you again. Recently, we held a series of live events to launch our brand new Women, Peace and Security Forum. These events included participants from the Army War College, United States Southern Command, and individuals from Florida International University. We reached over 200 people from over 35 countries. So in our commitment to continue education and true collaboration, we're now recording our second webinar. We want to continue the dialogue on a very eye-opening topic, the participation of women in narco trafficking. This is very relevant not only for women, peace and security, but for security and defense at large. And this is because we come to realize that in the context of striving for stability and global order, and while addressing crisis, conflict, and crime, we must consider the perspectives of women, men, boys, and girls. We also, more diligently, must understand that while women are victims, we're also defenders and protectors, humanitarians, and unfortunately also perpetrators. So as we will see today in this webinar, is that women participation in criminal organizations is not only a side story, is actually central to understanding the full scope of how these intricate criminal networks operate and how we can inform and devise effective strategies for disruption and deterrence. So to expand our knowledge, to make our tool set better, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Ms. Deborah Bonello. Deborah is a friend and one of the most courageous humans that I really have come in contact. She is very strong and has looked at very interesting things, eyeball to eyeball, boots on the ground. She's a journalist and an author, the former editorial director for Vice News Latin America. She has been based in the Western Hemisphere since 2007 and reported extensively on organized crime, both for media and think tanks. As a woman journalist, she also brings a gender perspectives to covered organized crimes, and she is the author of Narcas. Here's the book, Narcas, The Secret Rise of Women in Latin American Cartels. Welcome, Deborah. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Dewey. It's really good to be here with you again. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the motivations behind why I came to write the book. And then I will go through some of the protagonists that I profiled. If we could go to the first slide, we'll see, we can click through this one. We'll see, this is a dog that was behind a door in the tiny town of El Espiritu, which is on the border with Honduras and Guatemala. And that is where one of the women who came onto my radar very early in my investigations was. Can we flick through to the next one, please? Before I sort of go into the motivations, this is where most of the women that I focused on live and operated. All the women are now have now been through the US justice system, but I spent a lot of time at my desk, of course, researching, but spending time in Honduras, on the border with El Salvador and Guatemala, on the border with Guatemala and Mexico, but also time in Mexico, mostly in the state of Sinaloa, looking into women who were connected to the Sinaloa cartel. So it's important to bear in mind, you know, this part of Latin America is sort of lying between Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, where all of the cocaine in the world originates from, and the biggest market in the world, which is the United States, and actually increasingly Europe. But it's a very important land bridge for cocaine coming from south to north. And that's why so many of the women that I covered were based there. We can go to the next slide. So just a little bit about me. I was born in Malta, brought up in the UK, you know, born into a very sort of conservative Catholic family, I guess, and always felt a little bit like the odd one out, I suppose. I never really wanted to be in high heels and makeup, much to the chagrin of my mother, and sort of kind of got used to being a rather atypical girl, I think, when I was growing up. And that sort of gave me this experience of being an outsider, but also curiosity about other women who tended not to fit into the sort of stereotypes, I think, around femininity and you know what we're supposed to be doing as opposed to maybe what we want to be doing. And so after getting to Latin America in 2007, I was always covering organized crime as part of the general news beat, because of course that was when the then President Felipe Calderon launched the drug war in Mexico, the militarized crackdown on drug traffickers. So, you know, massacres, shootouts, all the gruesome things around that were always part of the daily beat. Here we can see Chapo Guzman, of course, the then leader of the Sinaloa cartel, and Pablo Escobar from Colombia. So both of these men really dominated the narrative around organized crime. And you know, as a journalist, like, the media is partly responsible for having kind of made them into these sort of legends, if you like. But it always was strange to me, given what I just told you about the way I sort of was formed as a girl. It was very strange to me that the only women that we saw in organized crime were sort of the mob wives, the trophy wives, or, you know, the killers with a golden gun. I think if we switch to the next slide, you know, this, I feel, is also the wrong question. You know, who is the female version of El Chapo? What I started asking as I was writing about organized crime, and also as I was working for think tanks like Insight Crime, which is a think tank dedicated to organized crime in the Americas, I felt like, you know, why do we only see the wives? And are there women? I was asking myself, you know, are there women within the ranks of organized crime who we're not seeing, who do hold power, but we're not seeing because of our expectations and the narratives around men in the drug trade? And so people would ask me, you know, when I told them what I was studying, like, is there a female version of El Chapo? And I would say, that's not really the right question, because the way that we even perceive power in organized crime is very much based around violence, which isn't to say that women aren't violent. They very much can be, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But I really think it was a case of sort of changing our sort of perceptions and conceptions of what power even is. And I found that women in the ranks of organized crime weren't just violent protagonists. They were money laundering, they were transporting, they were oiling the wheels of corruption that help drug cartels exist. So part of the aim of the work was to try to get to people to think outside the parameters of these male narratives and male definitions of organized crime that we've come to understand, and what is essentially a male gaze, both in the media and in law enforcement, that tends to minimalize and sexualize women in the drug trade instead of sort of see all of them and understand them for what they really are and the roles that they play. You can go to the next slide, please. So here we have on the left, we have Griselda Blanco, who is probably the most famous drug trafficking matriarch in the public eye. And to the right of her is one of the sort of female protagonists from the Narcos Mexico series. Now you can see that these women look very different, you know, and it's a good example of what I'm talking about. You know, Griselda Blanco, you know, by the time, as you know, Netflix have just done this series of her, and Sofia Vergara did her best to sort of dumb down her beauty. You know, Griselda Blanco doesn't fit into the stereotype that we're seeing on the right. You know, in Narcos Mexico, the female protagonist was this like super hot, super young protagonist. She was based loosely around, I think, Sandra Avala Beltran, who was a prominent figure in the Sinaloa cartel, who I document in my book. But the reality and the fictional representations that we see of women in organized crime are very different. And I think that's important to bear in mind when we conceptualize the role of women in organized crime. Let's go to the next one. So Emma Coronel, who is Chapo's wife, was a daily presence at the trial of her husband, which sort of spanned 2018 and 2019 in New York. And Emma is really kind of the sort of archetype of the mob wife that we tend to see. She, after Chapo was convicted for life, she then sort of turned herself into the authorities. She was sentenced to 3 years, which is a pretty short sentence when you consider how much she knew. But she is perceived as being generally the most powerful woman in the Sinaloa cartel, and I would argue that her power was pretty superficial, and it was ultimately tied to the association that she had with El Chapo, her husband, the father of her twin girls. But I would say that the sort of ignoble title of most powerful woman in the Sinaloa cartel goes to Guadalupe Fernandez Valencia, who I think might be in the next slide, if we can switch to that. So Guadalupe was the only woman on the indictment that helped put Chapo away for life. There are, I believe, 8 or 9 names on that indictment. She's the only woman. And that really stood out to me. You know, I covered it all. I covered the Chapo trial quite extensively when it was taking place and spent a lot of time with those documents. And I remember seeing her name and thinking, oh, why have I never heard of her? You know, did some open source research. She had pleaded guilty in a court in Chicago after she was arrested about a month after Chapo. And after that guilty plea, she sort of disappeared from view. And I figured, oh, well, maybe no one's written about her because, you know, there isn't very much information about her. And then I sort of started digging into her case on Pacer and found all sorts of information about her. And, you know, I think part of the reason that she didn't elicit much curiosity, for better or worse, is because she looks like an archetypal Mexican abuelita. You know, she's not young and beautiful the way Emma is. And, you know, I think that doesn't feed into the narratives that we're used to seeing about women in organized crime. She was kind of, you know, Chapo's chief money launderer. She worked very closely with one of Chapo's sons, Alfredillo, who is one of the 4 Chapitos, who has been so in the crosshairs of the DEA for the last few years. And Alfredillo, her former cohort, remains at large and remains on the lam in Sinaloa right now. Since she's been in custody, a number of new indictments have been issued against the Chapitos, one of which alleges that they tested fentanyl on human guinea pigs and fed their victims to tigers. All sorts of information that, you know, you could really only know by being sort of very close to the cartel and working very closely with the Chapitos. So she turned out to be a key collaborator. And her time with Chapo's sons was not her first rodeo. She was born in Michoacan. She migrated undocumented to the US in, I think, the late 80s, early 90s. She got into drug dealing on the streets of California, where she was caught and spent a decade in prison. She got deported back to Mexico, and that's when she got involved with the Sinaloa cartel, in part through the participation of her brothers and other family members. But, you know, yeah, she stayed very much out of view, and she is sort of a prime example of the kind of women that I'm talking about. And her case is what kind of initially got me interested in this issue. And as I dug deeper, you know, I found out so much about her. We can move to the next slide. Lucila Nefarjado Campos was another woman, another protagonist from the Sinaloa cartel. So her role was very different to Guadalupe's. She basically ran her own independent trafficking ring with her adult sons. But witnesses in her court proceedings, she did not plead guilty and she went to trial. Witnesses who took part in that trial said that she spoke directly on the phone to Chapo Guzman. So it's likely that she had the sort of blessings of the Sinaloa cartel within within Sinaloa to sort of run this operation. She was eventually arrested in Colombia when she was down there, sourcing product and working towards furthering the interests of her trafficking ring. As soon as she was arrested, or a few days after, her sons were murdered in Hermosillo in Mexico. An act that not only devastated Luz by all accounts, but she also took as a sign to keep her mouth shut when she was in custody, which probably contributed to her decision not to plead guilty and to go to trial. Her grandparents and father and sister all still live in Culiacan, Sinaloa. So I suppose she was also very cogent of the fact that other members of her family could suffer the consequences of her involvement. She actually trained as a lawyer. Like, hers is a very interesting example of someone who had a university education, had other options available to her. I'm not sure quite why and what were the motivations for her going into the drug trade, but I do know that that wasn't the only option that she had. And hers is a very interesting case and sort of different to Guadalupe's in a way. Can we go to the next slide? Marixa Lemos Perez is a woman who was based on the border with Guatemala and El Salvador. She and her family were part of this sort of political nexus that at various points held political power in the town. Marixa's sister, Mayra, was an aspiring mayor and was taking part in local elections when she was gunned down during part of her political campaign in the town of Moyuta. She was eating in a restaurant when a couple of trucks pulled up full of armed men, and they opened fire on the entire party, and Mayra was killed. When that happened, Marixa stepped up to sort of try and win the mayorship that Mayra had been competing for, which never happened. And Marixa was eventually imprisoned after she was found to be running a kidnapping ring. The reason why that part of the world where she was based on the border with El Salvador was so potentially lucrative for local politicians and continues to be is because if drug traffickers have to operate, that a lot of drugs are moving from Colombia to the south by land through El Salvador and Guatemala on their way to the United States. And if you have political control over those parts of Latin America, then that can prove to be quite profitable for you because you tend to coordinate with traffickers in terms of what's passing through your territory. And in fact, when I was there, I was sat at the restaurant where Marixa's sister Mayra was gunned down with my local source, and we were seeing container truck after container truck come through the border on its way north. And it's in the container trucks that so much of the cocaine is buried away. We know that the container industry is now a major distribution channel for traffickers. But Marixa was fascinating. I got into prison to see her, and I only had half an hour. The authorities took away my recorder, so I could only write down notes. And in that half an hour, she sort of cried and laughed and had this whole kind of plethora of emotions, but was rather delighted to hear that her political rival in Moyuta, who won the election in which she competed, was terrified of her. And she made no bones about using violence to further her interests. She actually managed to escape from prison twice, which is how she earned herself the moniker of Guatemala's version of El Chapo. But she was a super fascinating person, definitely operating on a smaller scale to the likes of Luz and Guadalupe, but a very clear example of a woman who understood the value of being able to use violence to further her political and business interests, for sure. At some point, she allegedly tried to assassinate her political rival 3 times. She didn't manage that, and he's still Roberto Marroquin is still the mayor of the town that Marixa lived in, but a very confident, ambitious individual for sure. We can go to the next slide. We can skip this one. Thanks, Robert. Digna Valle was the woman who I went to investigate, and the picture that was at the beginning of this presentation of the dog behind the doors. Digna was based on the border of Honduras with Guatemala. She and her family used to transport cocaine across the border of Honduras into Guatemala on its way to Mexico. She was the first of the Valle family to be arrested in either 2013 and 2014. And thanks to her, the DEA managed to arrest her brothers and other members of the cartel, and essentially, dismantle a significant part of the leadership. And Digna was sort of fascinating. I asked her for an interview a couple of times because by the time I was investigating her, she was sitting in immigration detention with the prospect of being deported back to Honduras after having done her time in the US. That struck me as rather unfair, given the collaboration that she gave to the authorities in the US to bring down her family's trafficking organization. She didn't want to speak to me, so I figured I'd go to her hometown, poke around a bit, speak to people about her, which I did. I went with the local bishop, and it proved to be a very fruitful trip. We spoke to people who lived next door to Digna and who worked with Digna. And in fact, one of those people, when I was sitting in the front room, got Digna on a video call with me from her base in Houston, where she was at the time. She seemed a little discombobulated, and I don't think she realized I was the journalist who'd been bothering her for years for an interview. But when I was there, the people spoke very highly of her. They helped build this. I think if we skip forward a bit, there might be some pictures of the church that she helped build in El Espiritu. I'm not sure I included those, but her family were very much kind of, at least in the early days, benefactors of the local town. They used to give jobs to people through the coffee fincas that they owned. They built the Catholic Church, and she was very proud of that when I spoke to her on the phone. But of course, other asylum seekers who had fled El Espiritu under the rule of the Valle cartel told me that Digna was sending out hits on people who weren't benefiting or protecting her family's organization. So I got very mixed accounts of Digna and what she was like. And of course, without having been there at the time myself, it's very hard to know quite how violent she was, but those were the accounts I heard. And I do think that she learned that she had to use violence to protect the interests of her family organization. We can go to the next slide. This is the Catholic Church that she and the Valle family helped to build in El Espiritu. You can see there, those are the benches that are scattered outside the entrance to the church, bearing her name and the name of other family members. So she was very proud of this community work that she had done. And I think, at least in the early days, loved and respected by the people who lived in that tiny village. We can click on. Finally, Marjorie was what the US Treasury Department described at one point as the most prolific drug trafficker in Latin America. She was moving millions of dollars in value for the drug cartels around the region. She initially got into the business via her husband, who was arrested and imprisoned. Marjorie was subsequently approached by the Colombian organizations he used to work for, and requested to continue laundering, which she did, and far excelled her husband's achievements in that sense. Again, like Luz, she had an education. She actually owned a few of her own illicit businesses before she got into the drug trade. But when net began to close around Marjorie, she realized that if she didn't want to spend the rest of her life in jail, she was going to have to hand in a number of her criminal protagonists, which she did. And if you read, I think it's chapter 3 in the book, it talks about how she was doing a drug deal with a couple of other female colleagues, and essentially she was sort of communicating directly with DEA on the shipments and how it was going. And it was that kind of collaboration that helped get her a fairly short sentence in in kind of relative to the kind of crimes she was accused. We can go to the next slide. The other thing to take into consideration about women in organized crime is there's very much, at least in Mexico, very much an aspirational culture around the cartels. And this is a picture of a woman I met when I was on a shooting range in Culiacan, Sinaloa. The man who taught Emma Coronel how to shoot a gun runs self-defense courses for women who want to learn to defend themselves. But you can see, you know, the nails, and like you can't quite see her face. I didn't really want to give her identity away, but women very much model themselves on Emma Coronel, you know, the flattened hair, the whitened skin, the nails. And there's a buchona look, which is sort of like a whiter Kim Kardashian before Kim Kardashian had all her implants removed. There's a type of surgery that women strive to get in Culiacan, and women come from other places in the world to get, that sort of sculpts that buchona body. And the point is not necessarily that you are part of the drug cartel, but that you look like you are connected to the drug cartel, which affords you a certain amount of sort of social capital and status and empowerment. And you do see that culture is very much on steroids thanks to social media, and both sort of empowers and victimizes women at the same time. But it's very important to remember that the perception of the drug trade, perhaps in the US, is one of, you know, the bad guys against the good. But for a lot of people in Latin America, people who can enrich themselves and sort of achieve that social mobility and empowerment against the odds, which are, you know, pretty low if you're born into grinding poverty, like a lot of people in the drug trade are. People aspire to that. They see it as this kind of rags to riches story. And, you know, the aspirational culture around the fashion and the buchona look is all part of that. I think we can move to the next slide. This is another part of the aspirational culture. I did a story about a girl who found an Uzi in her grandmother's cupboard, probably left there by her father. And she tried to pose with the Uzi to make a TikTok video, and the gun went off and killed her. And it's just kind of very sobering to think that young girls would have that sort of concept in mind, you know, that posing with an Uzi on TikTok is cool. We can go to the next one. This is to do with what I was talking about before, this aspirational culture, the buchona body. It's not to be underestimated how powerful the pull of this is. You know, I spoke to women in Culiacan who had sort of cut price surgery to try and look like this. They couldn't afford the kind of top surgery. And there are a lot of charlatans who are dentists and dermatologists posing as plastic surgeons and aren't, and then perform surgeries that are actually not qualified to do. And those surgeries go terribly wrong. So I did meet the family of one girl who had died after getting a cheap lipo procedure. So it's worth bearing in mind that there are dangers to that aspiration as well, and women are prepared to put themselves deeply at risk in order to get the buchona look. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. I mean, this is a sort of summary of the book and the points that I've been making. But what I hope to leave with people who are watching is that we really need to open our eyes and open our minds in terms of the potential that women have in Latin American organized crime today. I think I'll stop there, Dewey.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for really shedding light into this intriguing facet of narco culture. And I really appreciate your work because it gives us a new grasp and understanding of this complex problem and that has far-reaching effects. So thanks. Now I have a couple of questions for you. I'm curious, why does women have gone for so long for so long under the radar, right? Like I know that I keep showing your book. I highly recommend here the book. Your book came out. Netflix has a Griselda Blanco, her story. Now, little by little, we're putting the pieces together. We see that they're prolific, as you said, prolific narco traffickings, lethal influencers, decision makers. Why did they go under the radar for so long?
My theory is that a lot of it is to do with the male lens that exists both in law enforcement and in the media. And I think that women who are young and attractive, like Emma Coronel, tend to dominate the attention around women and organized crime. Like you can see from those photos, so many of the women I documented were in their 40s or 50s or 60s. They looked like, Mexican abuelitas. They just don't really attract much attention when it comes to creating narratives and headlines and what have you. And I also think that, agencies like the DEA and Southcom and, all the sort of US anti-narcotics branches, as well as Latin American law enforcement, tend to be dominated by men who are looking for men, who assume that men are the most powerful protagonists and the women are just kind of standing at the stove stirring the sauce. And I think women use that to their advantage to go under the radar a little bit. And so I think that's the main reason. And because for so many of those women, the more I dug into Pacer and their cases, I found such a plethora of information. I just don't think anyone was actually looking for it.
That goes, side by side with the Women, Peace, and Security framework. So we want to elevate the status of women and not underestimate their power, but there is good power and there is bad power. And I think, for both, we need to bring it to light. One, to really continue to reinforce, and the other one to help us solve these very critical, complex, wicked issues. Then my
Yeah.
second question, and you did talk about the, defense and security, but here we have an increase now more and more with global security from a US perspective, a strategic competition. So from your firsthand experiences, how can this nuanced understanding of the criminal dynamics, and here we're talking about women in the narco trafficking world, in that arena, how can that understanding support how the work of security and defense professionals, but also academics that are influencing policy and solutions, how having this knowledge can help us to address these complex issues?
I think organized crime in Latin America is fundamentally clan-based. So I think we really need to have a fuller understanding of how it's families, not just the men in the families, who are creating these organizations. And I do think that the proclivity of, family disintegration in Latin America, the prevalence of single mother families, the different implications of incarcerating women to incarcerating men. The women are usually the primary caregivers. And, how we bring up our children is probably the most important job that societies have, right? If your mom is put in jail for trafficking when you're, a kid, your future is already like in jeopardy because you lose your primary caregiver. That's the main example to you. You have a lot more physical freedom in terms of what you do, and like I think children can be really sort of lost in those years if their mothers are put away. So I do think we need to kind of come up with some new solutions that deal with the dynamics of women in organized crime, some disincentives that aren't just punitive and about putting women in prison, and of course the creation of a more egalitarian society where women have more access to less risky forms of economic empowerment, but also policies that just focus less on punishment and more on deterrence. We have seen that whoever's in the White House, the status quo of the drug war tends to be maintained in Latin America. And yet the amount of cocaine that Colombia is producing is more than it's ever been. And so we're seeing that, US-funded drug eradication, the kingpin strategy, its effect on the drug trade is pretty limited. So maybe I do hope that the research can help us come up with perhaps, alternatives to the punitive ones that have been followed in the region, and focus a little bit more on prevention and deterrence instead of punishment.
As you were answering this question, it comes to mind when we were talking about clan-based networks and how really to disrupt that, and also interesting what you showed about pop culture, right? It's something that's cool, and then the younger generation, it's open and normalizes this idea is really how to go a little deeper. We have the force and strength, so balancing that knowledge.
Yeah, and also kind of the role that social media plays in the sort of promotion of this lifestyle and sort of feeds the aspirations of people who are in disempowered poor communities, and proffers this idea that this is a way out of poverty, which to a lot of people it is. And I think they go into it knowing that they may not live a long and prosperous life, but rather a short and prosperous life. But that's a very strong pull for a lot of young people today, and worth bearing in mind, I think.
Yes, really dismantle this idea that's cool to be a narco mommy or a narco papi, as you mentioned before. I'm going to ask you one more question, but this is personal. I know that you are really looking at issues, the true crime, security, defense. What are you working on? What's next for you? I know you wrote this book, but what's next for you?
So I'm looking into the case of Ecuador, which we've seen sort of really disintegrate over the last few years. It was one of the most peaceful nations in the world, and now it's become, if not a narco state, very close to one. We saw in January, it made headlines all over the world when male gang members broke into a live TV news broadcast. The prisons are in complete disarray, chaos all over the streets. And a lot of the sort of violence and disintegration we're seeing in Ecuador is blamed on the international cocaine business, which is now being run through the ports of Guayaquil in the container industry. So narco states around Latin America. We also recently had the conviction of Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who got convicted for drug trafficking. He's yet to be sentenced. But I'm trying to write a book with a flippant narrative about how narco states are created by organized crime. So the working title is, how to create a narco state, a manual for aspiring criminals. But it's really looking at the ways that organized crime infiltrates the state and brings a democracy to its knees. And that's something that we're increasingly seeing all over Latin America. So yeah, that's the next project.
Thank you. Very excited. And I'm not only because I know that you're going to do a fantastic job, but again, reiterating that I know that you're going to look at this also from a gender perspective. And so appreciate your work, not only as a former defense person, but also in women, peace, and security. And also that you validate the importance of collaboration. We're working with academia, professionals, and uniformed professionals, and also true journalism. All hands on deck to bring light and solve those issues. So thank you so much.
Of course, and thanks for elevating the book and giving it so much visibility, Dewey. I really appreciate it.
100%. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up, but I do want to tell our audience, I encourage you again to look at the book. Also look at our resources in the Women, Peace, and Security Forum that is under the Jack Gordon Institute for Policy webpage. Participate in our future webinars, watch it, continue the conversation. We have a hashtag FIUWPS. Stay tuned for the show notes. You will see Deborah's information more about her book. And thank you again, Deborah, for being part of the Women, Peace, and Security Forum from the beginning. And I look forward to continue working with you.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it too.